Welcome back to Sprague Homestead. Now, we recently talked about the 5 worst livestock injuries we've had on our homestead. And one thing we promised you was to give you a list of all the things we keep in a medical emergency for our livestock. So today, we've got everything laid out on the table, and you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, that looks like chaos. But what we're going to do is take all of our products, move them to the side, and on this side, we're going to cover everything by category, whether it's parasites, foot care, miscellaneous, or other. We're going to make this a list and make it easy for you to have all of these products available for your homestead.
Okay, so the first category we'll talk about is when you're dealing with parasites. And this doesn't seem to matter if you're dealing with cows to chickens. Eventually you will get something. Lice, mites, ear mites, worms, doesn't really matter. So being that we have poultry, goats, dogs, and rabbits around here, there's a pretty good selection of stuff. This is not everything that we actually keep, but we do keep poultry and garden dust for the chickens in case we get mites. You want something like Corid, especially if you've got cows. This is a coccidia stat, so if you get coccidia, you can use this in rabbits. We don't typically, because we're so dry here, we don't deal with a lot of coccidia. But I do occasionally buy rabbits from other areas that are more prone to wetness, so I like a good coccidia stat. This used to be really effective in goats, but as we kind of have done the research through it, there are some other products that are better for goats. But a lot of times, at least in the state of Oregon, this is all you can find. Now, for intestinal worms, what we like is I use Ivomec for the rabbits. Or I use Wazine, which is water soluble, so you can actually put this in the water. This is marketed for poultry, but the dosage for rabbits is the same. For goats, we prefer to use fenbendazole. This is an oral drench, really easy to do. We also have the injectable Ivomec when we need it. Now in the rabbits, when I use it topically. But if you're using it injectably, you are going to need these beauties, needles and syringes. Now, when you also get into ear problems, while we don't have a whole lot of problem with ear mites in our goats, we do, as you probably know, get them in our rabbits from time to time. So we have our ear mite medicine for the rabbits. And one of the dogs that we adopted actually had some ear mites come with her. And so we do keep some ear stuff for the big dogs as well. With cows, a lot of times, or horses, you'll probably also use a topical drench for worms, whether that's lice or intestinal worms or what have you. So make sure that you either talk to a vet or a good farm supply store that can direct you as to what you should probably be purchasing there. So the next category we're going to talk about is going to be wound care and topical type stuff. So when you're talking about this kind of thing, the one thing that you probably don't see on the table that you're wondering about is things like gauze pads, wraps, towels, blankets, and that sort of thing. Now, I don't like to show those because I keep mine washed, clean, and actually vacuum sealed with the big vacuum bags to try and keep them clean and sterile. So I don't really want those out here, and they don't show very well through the bag. So you want to make sure that you've got a good supply. How we do ours is when washcloth, towels, and hand towels, blankets, that kind of stuff gets worn out, these are prime candidates to be turned into livestock rags. The big box of rags that you can get from like Home Depot, the little white ones, those things actually make excellent wound cleaning rags. So that's another thing you might want to look at. But it's really important to have that kind of stuff. When you're dealing with wounds, you also want a really good antibacterial wash. Now there's a lot of stuff on the market. I've had really good luck with the betadine solution, so this is what I tend to use. The bad thing is it is yellow and it will stain. At least in my experience, it stains. So whenever you're dealing with stuff like this, you want to make sure that you've got latex gloves of any sort that you want to use. It doesn't hurt to buy a box of them. They're not that expensive, and just put them in your first aid kit for stuff that you need. It also helps to keep the wounds cleaner. A lot of times when we're dealing with wounds in the barn, you don't have time to come in and wash up really, really well, but you might be able to pull on some gloves and just get to work, because a lot of times in injuries, time is of the essence. So once we've got wounds clean, if they're not so deep that they require some kind of stitching, then you're looking at stuff to apply to them. So what we like is a whole variety of stuff. Now in our poultry, we use the Pick No More. This keeps the birds from picking on each other. and it also helps to heal them up. So we use that. In our rabbits, goats, dogs, what have you, I like the Vederson products. Now we use a couple of different ones. This is the antimicrobial hydrogel, and this is the basic wound and skin care. They've got pretty good instructions on the back that tell you how often you should be applying it and in what cases. Of course, not everything is good in every situation. We also use stuff like Blue Coat or Blue Lotion. It's basically the same thing. This is also very staining. If you want to be purple, try using it without any gloves. Otherwise, I would highly suggest that you have gloves with it. Now, if you've got skin cracks and that sort of thing, especially when you're dealing with does that have been nursing and that sort of thing, or if dryness is an issue, we do keep some bag balm on hand. It's kind of a lotiony balm which will help heal up cracks and that sort of stuff. The other thing you might run into when you're dealing with topical wounds is something that's bleeding quite a bit. Now, you probably want a good manual, like the Merck veterinary manual, that kind of walks you through when is the appropriate time to just let things bleed and when you should probably be concerned and try and get stuff stopped. Now, in the rabbits especially, there are some breeds that when you clip toenails, time is of the essence. You really want to get them stopped. Believe it or not, I have heard of rabbits bleeding out from bad toenail jobs. It doesn't sound like that would even be possible, but that kind of blood clotting issue does exist in some of your Angora lines and some of your English lops. So you want to make sure that you have something kind of like the Wonder Dust, which is a wound powder. It has charcoal and a bunch of other stuff in it, but it actually does promote clotting. So this is kind of a nice thing to have if you've got a wound that you need to get the bleeding stopped. Some of this with a gauze pad on top of it does wonders at getting stuff clotted. Another thing that you might need when you're dealing with a wound, especially when we're dealing with animals, right? Sometimes hair is in the way and you can't really see what you're doing. This is something I've never seen on anybody else's list, but something I've used, and that is these little tiny cordless dog trimmers. I actually have mine. It's battery powered. I have mine for my little dog, my house dog. But sometimes these things are invaluable. When you go to the vet and you've got an animal that's injured, what's the first thing they do? They usually shave around the injury. So when you're thinking about, trying to deal with an injury yourself, you might want to consider having some of these on hand. Now that's most of the products I use for topical type injuries. One other thing that we like to keep on hand is good old hydrogen peroxide. Peroxide gets a bad rap. A lot of people don't know how to use it correctly. But it's really important in stuff that you might have a lot of dirt on the inside and you cannot get it to irrigate out with a good wash. Peroxide and its bubbling ability, you can take a syringe without the needle, squirt it into a puncture hole and really flush a lot of stuff out. It does burn, which a lot of people don't like and makes it a little hard on the animals. But we keep it anyway, just because you never know when you're going to need it. This is also an invaluable thing if you end up with an animal that's getting fly strike or maggots in its injury. Maggots do not like peroxide, and this stuff will flush them out of wound holes faster than anything else I know. They just flat out don't like it. Of course, nobody wants to deal with fly strike, but it's definitely something that you want to keep in hand, especially if you get an injury in the summer. It can get bugs in it pretty darn fast, so something you should definitely have in your kit. All right, so next we're just going to talk about eye care. Now, there's not a whole lot that goes on here unless you've got cows and are dealing with pink eye. My understanding is goats will occasionally get it, but I've never actually seen that. If you're dealing with pink eye, you probably need to go to a vet or a farm supply store and get some kind of medication for it. But most of what you're going to deal with is going to be, somebody smashed somebody else in an eye, somebody got hit with a pine cone, dirt, dust, some kind of scrape. I've had goats get pokes in the eye with hay, all sorts of stuff. We like the Vederson products again. So there's an eye wash to make sure you've got everything out, and then there is an actual gel. Now, if this stuff doesn't take care of it, you can also get tubes of terramycin, which is an antibiotic. It's about that big of a tube for about $20-25, and you can use that if you've got some kind of infection in the eye or something like that. Eyes are pretty important, so while I fully would recommend you try to take care of stuff at home, if it looks very severe, you might be better off going to a vet. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk about is calming agents. Now, not everybody uses these, but I think they're absolutely invaluable. Very species dependent for the most part. We like to keep calming tabs for the dogs because nobody wants to fight a 120-pound dog that's upset. I keep Rescue Remedy for pretty much everything else. You can actually buy this stuff at like Walmart and natural grocers now. It's actually marketed for people. They do have some pet specific, but it's one of the herbal essence kind of deals where you wait it about 10-15 minutes, and it'll kind of kick in. It just promotes calming. You can also use topicals. So I've got the aches and pain salves for times that you are castrating things like goats and sheep, goats, cows, that sort of thing. So you put it on there, you give it about 15 minutes. It basically is a topical agent that just numbs everything up. This can be used for other animals too. So if you've got an injury and it's real touchy on a goat, you can smear some on there and just give it 10 or 15 minutes before you start working. As long as it's not anything vitally important as far as it's not bleeding or anything like that. This makes it a little easier to deal with an animal that's not quite in so much pain. Alright, so the next thing we'll talk about is going to be your fungicides. Now, everybody says this will never happen to them, but guess what? Eventually it happens to everybody. Whether it's ringworm or some kind of other topical infection. We actually had a house cat come down with ringworm. To this day, we have no idea where he got it years ago. But there's a lot of different stuff you can use. They make hydrocortisone that you can pick up at like Walmart. If it's a foot disease, you can get all kinds of different stuff for thrush, antibacterial. I've used Hoofflex, both different kinds in donkeys and in the goats when we've had problems arise. You can also get a chlorhexidine type topical. Or if it's something specific, you can actually use, and people make fun of me on this, but with the rabbits and the goats, especially since you don't run into it a lot, anything made for athlete's foot. Athlete's foot, if you've ever had it, is a fungus. So guess what? Any over-the-counter fungicide will work. If you're dealing with a big area or several animals, though, or if it becomes a recurring problem on your farm, definitely probably take the time to invest in a bigger product just because then you've got it and you're not constantly making the cashiers at your local store wonder what's going on in your feet. So next we're going to talk about foot care. I know you're probably thinking, how many sections does this thing have? Well, foot care, as we're probably all pretty aware, is pretty important. Now, I don't recommend that you do any of your own farrier work. So if you've got donkeys or horses, that kind of stuff, you probably want to call a professional. If you're dealing with some kind of a foot rot issue, you're going to want to have a good hoof pick and a good thrush remedy. Believe it or not, you're probably wondering, hey, she doesn't have equines. Why do you have that? I use these for my goats. When I go to clip goat feet, this really does help me, especially in the winter months, to get a nice good cut on my feet for my goats. I can pick out any debris that's in there, brush it all off, make for a nice cleaning surface. The cleaner those goat feet are when you go to clip them, and I use something like this, the less wear and tear on your clippers, because nobody wants to have to sharpen or replace these guys. Now for the big dogs, I use a couple of different things. I like these safety clippers that kind of slide on, but these don't always work. Our girls especially do not like having their feet cut. And when that happens, and every now and then you'll get a toe, a dew claw, especially, that will curl up and you won't be able to get these on there. That's when I have to go to the big guys, the great big clippers here. I know people who use these for rabbits. I think they're a little big, a little scary for me. I can't really hold them in my hands. So I use these itty bitty little cat bird claw clippers. These are great for little house dogs, farm cats, and rabbits. We've also used these in poultry a number of times, especially when you keep your chickens up all winter like we have to keep the predators from getting them. Sometimes their feet will get a little long, so you can trim their nails with these, easy peasy, and it's done. When you're talking about foot care, make sure that you also have something like the Wonder Dust I was talking about earlier for wounds. Or I keep a little thing of cornstarch, actually, to promote clotting when you're dealing with maybe chickens that have gotten too long. Sometimes when you're cutting them back, you'll hit that quick. Rabbits especially. But it's handy to have even when you're doing goats. You never know, you might get into something, a crack you didn't see, and make them bleed a little bit. So you probably want to make sure you've got some of that. And I use this for the goats as well. If we've got a spot that looks a little soft and foot rotty, it's better to be prepared than to let them, get any worse and end up with a vet bill. Well, the last thing we'll kind of go through is the big group, motley group of all kinds of weird stuff. So as you go through your homesteading journey and have injuries, you're going to pick up weird stuff along the way. We are absolutely no exception. So some of the things that I like to keep in my kit, muzzles. You wouldn't think that the family dog who's so friendly today would try and rip your face off, but look, dogs get injured, and their natural instinct is to, kind of keep anything that might bother them off. That includes the dog that is so friendly to you. So what we do before we ever start dealing with an injury, even our most beloved pets, even our 7-pound dog, muzzle first. So we've got one of these for everybody on the farm because naturally nobody has the same size. You'll also want to make sure that you've got halters that fit all your goats, collars that fit your goats in case you're dealing with a face wound that you can't get to around a collar or a halter. You're going to also deal with a collar for all of your dogs. The moment they are injured is not the time to resize a collar. So we go through ours annually and make sure everybody's still fitting their collar nice. You want to make sure that you've got leads and that sort of thing. Halters for llamas, halters for sheep, halters for your goats and cows and, all of it. Because you want to be able to restrain them to actually do some work on them. So make sure that you've got all of that and that it's sized appropriately before you get started. You don't want to find out that the time your Nubian buck is injured that nothing fits them. So that sort of thing. The next thing is if going into breeding season here, let's talk about baby care. You want to always make sure you've got some backup colostrum and some of these nipples that actually fit on top of like pop bottle type things. Now, I don't recommend actually keeping milk powder. The odds that you're going to use this tends to be pretty low, but you want to have it on hand anyway. The colostrum is the most vital part of it. If you can get a kid that's maybe mom's not milking or has rejected, you want to get that colostrum into them quickly. You can do this for the first couple of days while you're going in to get milk powder. So make sure that you keep that on hand. We also make sure that we keep baking soda on hand and actually in the barns for all the goats. They'll kind of self-regulate if they've got a sour stomach, but a goat that's not feeling well and you suspect it's digestive gets lots of hay, isolated, and nothing but baking soda. It makes a huge difference. We also keep things like probiotics and electrolytes on hand. Now, these are packaged for chicks, so this is where you'll find them at the feed store. But I have used these even in the rabbits. They make bigger containers when you're dealing with bigger animals. Probios is one of them. But there's a whole bunch of different products there. I've seen online where people recommend Gatorade and Pedialyte when you're dealing with sick animals. Don't do that. There's no point. Go get the correct veterinary stuff. Remember that those are formulated for humans. These tend to be formulated for animals. And yes, there is a difference. A ruminant does not work like a human does. Other things to have, mineral oil. It's important for all kinds of stuff. If you've got a thermometer, one of the old rectal ones, unfortunately, which is what most animals use, your cat, dog, whatever, will thank you a million times if you just lube that thing up a little bit with some mineral oil. In a pinch, you can also use this to drown out ear mites in rabbits and even use it for a variety of things in goats, including sore teats and that sort of stuff. I also tend to keep some pretty animal-specific stuff. We keep some Vetericin, which is good for respiratory type problems in the rabbits. I've also got some stuff that's joint support. We've got joint support for the dogs. We even have some dog aspirin that we keep on hand. One of the other things that I've totally spaced out on wound care is you can get a liquid Band-Aid now that's animal-specific. You can use human liquid Band-Aid. I don't really like that stuff because it burns. We use it here all the time, and Kane and I usually refer to it as kind of our test of who's stronger, who can keep from crying when you put it on. So it makes it a little difficult to use in animals, but most of the stuff that they have out now you can find in the first aid section at your local feed store, and it's usually a pump sprayer as opposed to the little brush, and it's actually got some numbing agents in there to help keep them from getting too upset. On top of that, We also tend to keep a headlight, which is kind of a strange thing, I'm sure, but if you've ever dealt with a big animal, goat, anything like that, and you're trying to deal with an injury, it seems like the light is always behind you. So I find that a headlight gives me light directly where I'm looking and makes a huge bit of difference. The last little thing that I will tell everybody that I would strongly recommend that you keep is some form of antibiotic on hand. Now, they've changed the regulations for this a whole lot. We used to be able to keep the powdered terramycin on hand, and you can't do that anymore because you can't buy it without a veterinarian's script. But I would still recommend that you have either Durapen, Duramycin, Pen-G, something, an injectable on hand in case you run into an injury and have to treat it yourself. The Durapen and the Pen-G is actually pretty cheap for what it is. It lasts about 2 years in the refrigerator. It's very important to have on hand. You never know when you're going to use it. We've used ours on dogs, rabbits, goats. If you watched the last video, you know I used it to save our llama. So really important stuff to have there. So that is kind of an overview of what we have on hand. This is not everything. I'm sure I'm missing a whole bunch of stuff. What I would suggest if you're just getting started is pick probably wound care and foot care first and start just buying a couple things every month or so until you build out a pretty good kit. It can get pretty expensive. You buy everything all at once, and some of this stuff you really might not need all that soon. So buy the things you think you're most likely to need and start from there and then kind of accumulate as you go, which you'll find after, 10 years of doing this or so that when you start to make a video and start rounding stuff up, you think, oh my God, this is a lot of stuff, and this is only probably half. So if you have questions, leave them down in the comments. We would be happy to get back to you. What do you have in your first aid kit? Agree, disagree, things I might have missed? Go ahead and leave those down there too. So that's it for today from Sprague Homestead, and we will see you next time. Happy homesteading.